You also hear terms like anxiety, anger, violence, ineffectiveness, low self esteem. So, let us help our viewers to understand what is the distinction between these words, and especially, perhaps, maybe very simply, the words of uh, stress, anxiety, and depression. Because I think to the common man, this may appear to be words which are used interchangeably. So, maybe you can help us understand that a little better.
Okay. So, Nikhil, the extreme end of the stress is also very similar to anxiety, and this visual leads us to the discussion on anxiety. Now, first, let me begin with very simple definition of anxiety, and then we'll talk about how psychology defines it, and then talk about how we use it in the context of our work, and of course, the Gen Z. Right, and it's important to realize for our listeners that the Gen Z is now going through a tough phase. Many of them are looking at university education, right? Quite a few of them are struggling to cope up with life after COVID in terms of how the virtual world, when they were confined to a home, has now collapsed, and they are beginning to go back to reality. Some of them are figuring out setting up life beyond education, new jobs, and maybe new relationships. And all of this are major transformation phases in life, from being a student to primary or a high school student to a university student, or an employee, or a husband or a wife. And all of these stages create uncertainty that lead to some form of anxiety. Now, what is anxiety? In simple English, uh, if I am afraid of a situation where, say, after 9/11, I went and didn't know that airport queues will be long, and I end up in a queue and I miss the flight. This has happened in the past, 2007, say, when I went to US. I didn't know how they would look at security processes. Everything was changed. If I go back to the same country again, what will happen to me? I'm beginning to think about how it was last time I was there, and I'm already anticipating what will happen. Okay, so I'm projecting that I will have to go 4 hours early. I'll have to prepare my bags accordingly. So anxiety is when I'm considering how I was affected negatively in the past and worrying about what is going to happen next. Am I at the airport? No. Is the flight today? Now? No, it's 2 days away. But I'm already thinking how I will cope up with what is going to happen because of past experience. Therefore, in anxiety, I am going back and forth between past and future, past and future. In other words, it's exactly opposite of what we define as mindfulness, being in the present moment. I know it's preaching and it's not easy. However, this would give an idea of what is anxiety. Okay. Now, going into a bit of a textbook definition, just so that people who want to know more in a certain way, as per the DSM-4 standards of psychology, what you see on the screen is are set of contributors that lead to anxiety. Now, notice the anxiety is an outcome. It has multiple contributors. If I start at the bottom of the visual on the right, obsessive compulsive disorder. So, if I have an obsession before I take the flight to ensure that my home is locked, bag is locked, and if there's obsession, I continue to keep checking my bags. All right, this may lead to increased anxiety. An example: specific phobia. If I have claustrophobia and I'm not comfortable in closed spaces for long enough, for like more than an hour or so, then I'm already worried about how my long flight would be. And therefore, again, I'm already worried, and that is worrying about the future, anxiety. If I have a stress, now post traumatic stress disorder is a complex term. I'm just going to use it as an equivalent word of trauma. If I have a trauma of being late on the flight and then I miss the flight and then horrible time next 2 days, I'm already thinking of those traumatic 2 days I spent, and again that leads to increased anxiety. There are reasons why people have social anxiety disorders outside the scope, but people who have this are not comfortable in a large group of people. And if there's a long queue at the airport, I'm again very uncomfortable, and that makes me anxious. And beyond all of this, there may be generic reasons why I may have anxiety, and there are triggers, specific triggers to this GAD or generalized anxiety disorder. All of these situations could contribute to what we define as mind and body state of anxiety. Okay, so this is in nutshell how psychology looks at anxiety. And in all cases, we need to identify the contributors and not just work with anxiety alone. Can I spend some time on how we work and what are the other elements we consider in anxiety, Nikhil? So many of the previous slide elements are here. What we do is we assess anxiety along with depression. And there's a distinction, though of late it's important to realize that both happen interchangeably and they often coexist together. How? So when I'm too anxious for next 4, 5, 6, 8 hours and I cannot sleep, often this leads anxiety leads to poor sleep, and I spend a day or two like this. What happens is I do not have enough energy left. My body is kind of in a discharge mode. At this point, I feel sad about how I spend my 2 days. I have no energy and I become very dull, sad, and unhappy. That is depression. So, anxiety and depression are often coexisting. And sustained anxiety is often not possible. And therefore, the person, when goes through certain sustained anxiety, often feels depression, and then anxiety may come back, and at some point they may not have much of energy left, and then these individuals often have primarily depression and some anxiety, but they are part of the same coin and they both coexist in our experience. So we assess both of them, and important outcome of that anxiety problem is sleep quality. So we assess the sleep quality and, of course, together overall well-being. And then we look at the contributors, as you see, and there are quite a few of them. Certain experiences we go through before the age of 18, so between age 3 and 18, have a huge impact on depression and anxiety. Then trauma, as we discussed in the earlier slide, there are a host of lifestyle choices which correlate to increased anxiety. And they include poor sleep, poor diet, obesity, physical inactivity, of course, chronic sustained stress. Many of them result in increased anxiety and depression. And finally, irrational phobia or fear, and the balance between mind and the body. So there are some physiological imbalances that also result in anxiety. So when you look at all of this, you understand that anxiety is contributed by many root causes. So dealing with anxiety requires understanding what you see on the screen, these elements which contribute to increased anxiety, and dealing with each of those contributors in an effective manner will help us reduce the anxiety. And now that when you look at this situation, uh, a change of phase for a Gen Z, or just going through the struggle of post COVID world and uncertainties, would more likely to increase the anxiety versus not.